So first of all, I want to thank Archbishop Leo for issuing his memo about the Memorial Mass option for Pope Francis. And I have to admit, I wasn't thinking about doing a Memorial Mass until I saw that memo, so God bless him for that. I think looking back in retrospect, probably, we would have obviously prayed for the Pope, but probably we would have added his name as one of the intentions for our multiple intention masses. But the idea of having a separate mass off of the regular schedule, that's not something that would have necessarily occurred to me right away. So to get that memo, to have the opportunity to think about it, pray into it, was obviously really beneficial. Obviously, as you know, we talked about this on the weekend. So after getting that memo about the Memorial Mass option, there was a question of do we do it during the week when Pope Francis has died, or do it during the following week? And obviously we made the decision to do it during the following week to give people the chance, especially weekend Mass attendees, to come to the Memorial Mass after hearing about it over the course of the weekend. But funny enough, I gave everyone, I think, time to think about the concept of a Memorial Mass. So when you think about a Memorial Mass, a couple things immediately come to mind perhaps. So usually what happens is if you have a funeral, you attend and there's a body available, and so there's the body in the casket or there's the cremated remains. But if you have a situation where you don't have any variation of the remains, like the body's lost at sea, people can do a Memorial Mass. But you can also do it when you can't attend the funeral because it's being held, for example, overseas. And so obviously everyone would have loved to attend the funeral of Pope Francis, but they have the opportunity to celebrate this in the context of a Memorial Mass, again, off the regular schedule, giving the community a chance to reflect, to pray for the Holy Father, and to just really give thanks for his time as the Pope. It's a really beautiful thing. This morning I was thinking about it, and kind of what occurred to me was that these opportunities for us to solidify our notion of community by having these things is really kind of valuable, right? So certainly there's different ways for us to bolster our sense of community through parties and through social kind of informal get-togethers, but to kind of underline and foster and embolden our sense of a parish identity through things like this is really kind of important. You notice that when it comes to weddings, certainly, but especially when it comes to funerals. I've mentioned this many times before, but the parish community is especially great when it comes to funerals. There's a sense of we're together in this, and so we share in our joys, but also share in our sorrows. And so they have an opportunity where, there's a Memorial Mass for Pope Francis coming up on the Tuesday at 7 p.m. at St. James, and to have that on everyone's minds and on their hearts, and we talk about it, we share that experience, and we come to this moment. It's a really valuable thing. It helps people individually, but again, it really helps to foster a sense of community. For myself, when I heard about the passing of Pope Francis, I'm sure it was just like a lot of you. I heard it on Monday when he passed, and I saw it on social media. And a couple things kind of immediately came to mind. First of all, the fact that he died on the Monday after Easter Sunday, I think it's probably one of the first things that came to mind with a lot of people. So just imagine, you're going through Lent, you're going through Holy Week and the Triduum, and then you celebrate Easter Sunday as the Holy Father, and then you die the next day and you share in the resurrection in a particular way after celebrating that particular mystery with the holy people of God. Just how amazing that would be, how amazing that would have been for the Holy Father personally. But also the sense of validation of his pontificate. If he died, for example, on Good Friday, probably would hit people's hearts differently. But for him to die on the Monday after Easter Sunday, there's a sense of validation. Almost as if to say to the world, he was the Pope. Obviously he was the Pope, but there's an element of controversy out there. I was telling the weekday crowd shortly after he died that there was one Facebook group that said, if you say anything slanderous about the Pope, you will be blocked, And so there's something to be said about God the Father affirming his time here on earth as the Holy Father. Really kind of a beautiful thing. And for myself, I started to think about how he influenced my own priesthood. So when I thought about the Holy Father, it's kind of interesting. I was emotional in a way that I didn't expect. So in terms of my time as a Catholic and certainly as a priest, different popes, John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and obviously Pope Francis. Not to be reductive, but to oversimplify somewhat. You think about John Paul II, those World Youth Days, visiting all those different countries, so really embodying the missionary imperative. Pope Benedict, obviously the intellectual aspect of the faith, and Pope Francis, his thing with mercy and compassion, a certain kind of journeying with. And again, when I think about the timing of things, So I think shortly before I entered the seminary, John Paul II died. And so during my time of seminary formation, even my first couple of years of being a priest, Pope Benedict was my pope. And so to have that intellectual richness kind of floating in the background when I was learning how to be a seminarian and preparing for the priesthood, that was obviously really kind of valuable. And it's kind of interesting, when Pope Francis became pope, that was just before, I believe, I became pastor. So, as you know, I've had 4 placements: North York, Brampton, Oshawa, and here, and I was pastor in Oshawa. And before I became pastor there, Pope Francis became pope. And it's an interesting thing, I didn't realize, until after he died, just how influential he was to me, not just as a priest, but as a pastor. So I just want to share with you some thoughts about that. So one thing that was really notable about Pope Francis was his mastery of what we might call the prophetic gesture. The prophetic gesture, right? So it's one thing to say things to people. So for example, I tell you that I love you. It's another thing to show someone that you love them. To kind of frame the point I want to make, during seminary formation, there's a year where you go on field placement. And so you, for example, go to a hospital and you journey with the people there. And I remember going to Bridgepoint Hospital with a couple seminarians. And there was a guy, he was a chaplain there, and he was journeying with us and teaching us about pastoral work and stuff. And he said, one of the toughest assignments I ever had in terms of pastoral work here in the hospital, I was ministering to kids with special needs. They had sustained psychological trauma, or they had a certain congenital defects or whatever, and so they had cognitive difficulties. And it's kind of interesting, when it comes to adults, usually you can dazzle them and distract them with your credentials. So look how much money I have, look at my resume or whatever, right? But kids, they don't care about that, especially kids in that situation. And he said, I knew intuitively that all they cared about was, does this guy love me? Everything else, really, I don't care. I don't care how much money you have in the bank account. I don't care what your credentials are. I don't care that you were a doctor or a lawyer, wherever the case may be. Do you love me, right? And obviously it really pins you against the wall, because we all know intuitively, that's the ultimate criterion when it comes to the Christian faith. The demand of love. Do I love in this moment? Do I recognize a duty to love? And do I correspond and rise to the occasion, right? And he said, yeah, that was really kind of scary. Now, in contrast, think about Pope Francis. So all these different videos are coming up on social media and whatnot. And something that really kind of struck me, there's a lot of videos with him and kids. I don't know if you noticed that on social media. He'll be giving an address, he'll be sitting down, he has a microphone, he's flanked by different priests or cardinals, and basically he's giving his address, and all of a sudden a kid will come up. I saw a video today where this little girl just stood right in front of him, hands on the hips and stuff. It was super funny. And he wasn't flabbergasted, he wasn't shocked or anything. It's okay, here's this child, and touching the face and conversing with the child, and not in a short way too, a really long conversation. Meanwhile, the people are okay, get on with your talk type thing, right? And he's just spending this time with this kid in this really kind of beautiful way. It's funny, just recently we had a situation where we were journeying with a family, and the son, he had special needs, and we wanted to accommodate him and his family with regards to First Communion. So his mother would always bring him into sacristy at the end of Saturday Masses leading up to First Communion, just to get him used to the environment and the Mass and me and whatever. And so at the end, obviously I knew this guy, I knew his family. I went down to him and I knelt down, because I was thinking that's something Pope Francis would do. And I said, thank you, Tristan, really, you did great. And then he said, well, thank you, Father Eric. And I just almost burst out in tears. It was so beautiful. It's this mutual thing, right? So, I don't know. I remember in my last parish, I was helping a group of people with confessions. So a bunch of priests throughout the church, I think it was Lent or something. And they had a picture of that scene where Jesus says, let the little children come to me. And I don't know how you imagine it, but before I saw that picture, I imagined it being very safe and sanitary and whatever, right? But what you see is just chaos. Kids crawling everywhere, on the ground, in the trees and whatever, and parents running around. And here's Jesus just totally at peace. Right? And you get the sense that, okay, it's saying something, right? It's not about the children. It's this idea of, okay, this is where the church is supposed to be. The church should be comfortable with the messiness. And if she's not, that's a knock on the church as opposed to the people of God, especially when we're talking about the innocence of children. So here's Pope Francis, simply by entertaining and receiving a young child, when he could be doing more important things, teaching us quite a bit. The other example that comes to mind, basically there was a civil war in South Sudan. I think in a certain sense it's still ongoing. And what Pope Francis did was that he invited the leaders of this civil war to come to the Vatican for a spiritual retreat or a spiritual renewal. And then what he did, this always struck me, he bent down and he kissed the feet of all these different leaders, one at a time. And at this point, he's already quite old, and he had chronic leg pain. And so just imagine, he bends down and he kisses the feet of this person. And they have to help him up because he can't do it by himself. And he bends down and kisses the feet of this other person. And I remember it as like 2 people, but it wasn't. It was like 4 or 5 people, which adds a little something to the prophetic gesture, right? It's not simply, demonstrating something by actions as opposed to merely words. It's doing something which is hard. So here's something that I do, and I know that you know that it's difficult for me to do this. Also, it's couched in a sense of sacrificial love, and that's the thing which is memorable, and that's the thing which is life-changing as opposed to simply saying, I love you, or God is love. I remember adopting that sort of thing in my own priesthood. So I remember talking to some people at the parish office, and there was a situation where someone needed an anointing, and it wasn't close. It wasn't in town. It was like super far. And I had a ton of appointments that day, and it was getting really dark, and it was snowing and whatever. And basically, the feedback that came to me was like, Father, you can go the next day, and I'm sure the person will still be alive or whatever. And I said, no, I want to go tonight, because I want this person to have the memory that I went to him when it was this crazy snowstorm and when it was dark, because that's something that he'll remember forever. I remember a similar thing. There was a friend of mine who was in the hospital, and I thought, you know what, I want to get her a stuffed animal for every day she's in the hospital. And I thought she'd be in for a couple of days. She was in for a month, and so that was awkward. So initially I was like really picky, like, okay, I want to pick like this stuffed animal because I like the way the eyes go and I like the color of the fur. After a while, it's like, okay, here's something which looks stuffed and is an animal, so you get that. So, but later she showed me, there's a whole closet full of like stuffed things. It was just incredible. Anyways, the prophetic gesture. The other thing I learned with regards to the Pope, this notion of listening, really listening, as opposed to that thing we joke about all the time, like I'm waiting for you to stop talking so I can start talking. Actually listening. And to realize that's not a weak move. That's not a sign that I'm compromising. That's not a sign that somehow I'm not defending the faith. It's funny how we don't realize that. As you know, during Lent, I did a series of 1-minute videos for the podcast Catholic Latte. And I remember in the context of one video, I said, it's really important to encourage people and to affirm people. And one of the comments was like, well, Father, but it's really important to correct people too. And it's like, can you just give me a minute to tell people it's good to encourage others? But it's funny how we look at it like that. So here's this thing, you're saying this thing, and I don't want to compromise on the truth, the importance of fraternal correction, so I shoot you down. It's like, well, no, can't both things be true? It's not to water down the truth, but it's to kind of give due justice to the complexity of the human experience. This happened actually with a meeting of priests, actually. So basically what happened, there were a bunch of priests, we're all gathered together, and we were asked to work together to kind of share ideas. So one of the things was like, okay, this idea of listening. And I said, I find that some people like to meet in the office, some people are comfortable with that particular format, but some people, gosh, it's a lot for them to make an appointment with the priest in the office, never mind actually talk to the priest in the office. So I find for that reason, parties, for example, are really useful, or talking to people in the parking lot, or obviously going to their place for dinner where they have the upper hand and the comfort level and whatnot. So just a sensitivity to environments to facilitate the conversation. And basically the other guys were looking at me with blank stares. And then one guy said, well, I don't know, I prefer to meet people in the office. And it's like, wow, my heart just sank. I remember later on we were having a discussion about the nature of the church, the notion of the church being inherently missionary. The church doesn't just have a mission, the church is a mission. Go forth and discuss. And I remember some people being threatened by that. It's like, what? The church is inherently missionary. What about the church as the bride of Christ? We should talk about that. And it's like, again, can the church be both? And why do you feel threatened by this? And also, just given the state of affairs, given the state of the culture, what do people need to hear that the church is the bride of Christ or that the church is inherently missionary. Arguably the latter, right? And that's what Pope Francis tries to do a lot. So you notice what Pope Francis did over the course of his pontificate. He'll often say things which were controversial, and obviously people will get really upset with that. I secretly kind of enjoyed that. And the reason why, it's one thing for the Pope to say, you know what, you people should talk to each other about really difficult things. But would people correspond? I don't know, debatable. But if he makes a statement, and then, okay, you have at it, and then people talk, guess what? You're talking. I thought always that was a brilliant move. So you get both people on both sides of the ledger talking about difficult things, force them to kind of get in the room in a certain sense and share honestly what they think about this, that, and the other thing. So forcing people to go to a way of listening and dialogue, which is what we always should have done. Final thing, this notion of a certain kind of journeying with, is this notion of the church, right? So the church as a field hospital. This is a loose paraphrase, but Pope Francis, he once kind of said, I'd prefer to have a church which is bruised and dirty and bloody, as opposed to a church which is sick because basically it lives just for itself. The church is meant to be inherently missionary. We're called to go forth into the messiness. So you remember the Oscars like years ago, there was a really infamous episode where Will Smith, he went up on stage and he smacked Chris Rock, this comedian who was hosting. And what happened just before was that Chris Rock was telling a joke at the expense of Will Smith's wife. And so Will Smith was offended on behalf of his wife, came up and hit Chris Rock. And obviously a huge uproar around that. Over the course of discussion about that particular incident, someone said, you know, if you read Will Smith's biography, he talks about his mother. He says, I can remember a moment when I was 9 years old, and my father would always beat my mother. And one time he hit my mother so hard that she collapsed and blood was coming out of her mouth. And he goes, you know, when I think about everything I've done since, trying to be successful, trying to, you know, be the guy, be the man, all of it is meant to be an apology to my mother for being a coward and not being strong enough to defend her against my father. And he writes this when he's in his 50s. Now, someone might say, well, yeah, but he still shouldn't hit Chris Rock. Noted. But can we at least have a conversation about the 9-year-old kid who can't forgive himself for something which was never his fault? And that's what Pope Francis is trying to encourage, to have these difficult conversations, right? I was talking to a good friend of mine recently, and she was asking me, what's your favorite Pope Francis quote? I couldn't remember, but I remember that recently. He was interviewed once, like, who is Jorge Bergoglio? His name before it became Pope Francis. And he said, who is Jorge Bergoglio? I am a sinner who has been looked upon by the Lord. That's my favorite quote by Pope Francis. I'm a sinner who has been looked upon by the Lord. There's a lot there, right? You think about how the Lord looks upon his creation. So he creates, you know, the birds of the air, the fish in the sea. He looks upon it, says it is good. Looks upon the human person, it is very good. He looks at people who are crippled, who can't walk, who can't see. The look is not just compassionate and empathetic. The look is followed by an act of healing. So it's not just love in theory, it's love in action. And so here's Pope Francis, and like, okay, I could have been anyone. And I am a sinner. It's in my nature to rebel against the Lord, out of my selfish will, but also because of my human weakness. And here's the Lord, he looks at me with mercy and compassion and with this love which is meant to call me to greater things. And now I'm the Pope. And praise the Lord Jesus Christ. But here's the thing, right? That look that's bestowed upon Pope Francis, that's the way that God looks at everyone. That's the way he looks at you. That's the way he looks at me. That's the way he looks at your friend and your neighbor and your enemy and that person you don't like. So when you look at someone like a Will Smith, for example, It's easy to say, well, look, here's this guy who's acting out in some way. This person should not be angry. This person should not drink, for example, or act out in this particular way. The different ways that people act out. It's easy to have that conversation and simply call people out and stop. It's much harder and requires greater generosity and love to journey with people. In the midst of that, listen to them, listen to their experience. Tell me what you need, tell me what you want, tell me how you're hurting, how can I help you? Go through that whole process until they feel seen and known and loved, and journey with them until they are fully healed and therefore fully alive. In the immediate aftermath of Pope Francis's death, I was reading all these news stories, and you could tell people were looking up things. Okay, what's Pope Francis' legacy? Nothing comes to mind, so I look it up. Oh, his legacy was a certain predilection for the poor or a care for the environment. It's not like he didn't care about those things, right? But when I think about Pope Francis, what was his legacy? This clarity that to embody the Christian thing means that you embody hope and mercy and compassion for yourself, but also for the people of God.